June 12, 1945, Kempton Park Racecourse, Surrey, England. The rain fell soft and persistent over the makeshift prisoner of war camp, transforming the once pristine grounds into a labyrinth of mud and canvas. Beneath gray skies that seemed to mirror the uncertainty of a continent still bleeding from 6 years of total war, 23,000 German soldiers waited. They waited for food, for news, for judgment. Most of all, they waited to understand what their defeat truly meant. They had been trained to believe that capture by the British meant humiliation at best, extermination at worst. The propaganda films they had watched in Berlin and Munich had shown them caricatures of cruel Anglo-American captors, vengeful and merciless. Now, surrounded by barbed wire and watchful guards who spoke a language most did not understand, they prepared themselves for the systematic dismantling of their dignity. What they could not have known, what none of them could have imagined as they huddled in their tents that evening, was that they were about to witness something that would shatter every certainty they had carried into captivity. A simple radio broadcast, a voice speaking across the static, words that would begin the slow, agonizing process of rebuilding not just nations, but human souls. The British had not been prepared for the sheer scale of surrender. In the final weeks of the war, as the Third Reich collapsed like a house built on sand, hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers laid down their arms. The logistics were staggering. Prisoner of war camps sprouted across southern England like mushrooms after rain. Racecourses, agricultural fairgrounds, even cricket fields transformed overnight into holding facilities. Kempton Park alone housed more soldiers than many English towns. The British Army had requisitioned every available tent, every blanket, every cooking pot that could be spared from a nation exhausted by war. The German prisoners arrived in waves, transported in lorries from processing centers near the Channel ports. They came from every branch of the Wehrmacht. Infantry veterans of Normandy with hollow eyes and shrapnel scars, Luftwaffe ground crew who had watched their airfields burn, even a handful of U-boat crewmen who still smelled of diesel and seawater. What united them was defeat, and the gnawing uncertainty of what came next. In the Reich, they had been told stories. If you are captured, the British will use you as slave labor. They will starve you. They will parade you through London streets while civilians throw stones. Some believed these stories completely. Others harbored doubts. But doubt is a dangerous companion when you have nothing else. The camp itself was a study in contrasts. British efficiency met German discipline in an uneasy dance. Roll calls happened twice daily, punctual as clockwork. Food arrived in massive steel containers. Watery soup, dense bread, occasionally tinned meat, rationed carefully but distributed fairly. The British guards, many of them conscripts barely older than their charges, maintained professional distance. They did not fraternize, but neither did they brutalize. To the Germans, accustomed to the rigid hierarchy and casual violence of their own military structure, this cold correctness was bewildering. Where was the cruelty they had been promised? Where were the tortures, the interrogations, the systematic humiliations? Among the 23,000 prisoners, there existed a complex social structure. The officers maintained their authority even in captivity, organizing the men into work details, settling disputes, maintaining what they called Ordnung, order. Some clung fiercely to National Socialist ideology, holding clandestine meetings in the latrines where they whispered that the war was not truly lost, that secret weapons would still turn the tide, that the Führer had escaped to continue the struggle. Others, the majority perhaps, existed in a state of numb exhaustion. They had fought because orders demanded it, believed because propaganda had saturated every aspect of their lives, and now in defeat, they simply waited. The younger soldiers adapted more quickly. Hans Müller, 20 years old, formerly of the 12th SS Panzer Division, found himself fascinated by his captors. He watched the British guards during their shifts, noting how they spoke to each other with casual irreverence, how they shared cigarettes without rigid adherence to rank, how they sometimes smiled. This was not the behavior of the monsters he had been taught to fear. When a guard named Private Jenkins offered him a cigarette through the fence one afternoon, Hans took it with trembling fingers. "Ta, mate," Jenkins said, and walked away. The interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it planted a seed of doubt in soil long thought barren. The older men, veterans of the Eastern Front who had witnessed atrocities that no propaganda could justify or erase, kept their own counsel. They had learned that survival required silence, that expressing doubt was dangerous even in defeat. But they watched, they observed, and slowly, imperceptibly, they began to notice contradictions. The food, though simple, was adequate. The medical care, when needed, was provided without discrimination. The British did not separate prisoners by rank for punishment, did not execute officers, did not seem interested in revenge. These facts accumulated like water drops on stone, each one insignificant alone, but together beginning to wear away the narratives that had sustained them. On the evening of June 12th, word spread through the camp that the British were setting up loudspeakers. A broadcast, they said. The prisoners expected what they had always expected. Propaganda. Victor's justice translated into sound waves. They prepared themselves to hear about German crimes, British righteousness, the moral superiority of their captors. Some decided they would not listen, others determined to endure it stoically. None of them guessed the truth. The loudspeakers crackled to life at 1900 hours precisely. The sound cut through the evening mist, carrying across the sea of tents with startling clarity. The prisoners gathered in clusters, some standing at attention out of habit, others sitting cross-legged in the mud, most simply waiting with the patient resignation of men who have learned that fate is something that happens to you, not something you control. The voice that emerged was British, cultured, the accent of the BBC that even German intelligence officers had monitored throughout the war. But the words were not what anyone had anticipated. There was no triumphalism, no cataloging of German crimes, no demand for collective guilt. Instead, the broadcast began with a reading from the Gospel of Matthew. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." The translator, a German-speaking British officer, rendered the words carefully, respectfully, as though they mattered. For several moments, the prisoners simply stared at the loudspeakers, trying to process what they were hearing. Was this some elaborate psychological trick? A prelude to judgment? But the broadcast continued, and slowly its true nature became apparent. It was a religious service. A Church of England vicar, speaking from a studio in London, was conducting evening prayer, and explicitly including the German prisoners in his congregation. "We pray tonight," the vicar's voice continued, "for all those who suffer from the wounds of war, for the British who have lost fathers and sons, for the Germans who mourn their dead, for the Russians, the Poles, the French, the Americans, for all the families shattered by this terrible conflict. We pray that God, in His infinite mercy, might teach us the paths of peace, that He might soften hearts hardened by violence, that He might help us see in our enemies not monsters, but human beings who, like us, were caught in forces greater than any single soul could resist." The silence that followed these words was profound. Some prisoners wept openly, tears cutting channels through the dirt on their faces. Others stood frozen, their expressions caught between disbelief and something that might have been hope. A few turned away, unable or unwilling to accept what they were hearing. But most simply listened, transfixed, as the vicar continued to speak about forgiveness, about the possibility of reconciliation, about the Christian duty to love even those who had been enemies. That night, the camp did not sleep. In tents across Kempton Park, men who had not spoken honestly in years found themselves in halting, careful conversations. The broadcast had cracked something open, not a door exactly, but perhaps a window through which unfamiliar light could enter. Klaus Richter, a former schoolteacher drafted into service in 1942, sat with 3 other prisoners in their tent and spoke words he would have been shot for uttering a month earlier. What if we were lied to? The question hung in the air like smoke. One of his tentmates, a fervent believer in the National Socialist cause, stood up and walked out without speaking. But the other 2 remained, and gradually, carefully, they began to examine the edifice of beliefs that had structured their understanding of the world. If the British were not the cruel, inhuman enemy they had been taught to fear, what else might be false? If a British vicar could pray for German souls with what sounded like genuine compassion, what did that say about the propaganda that had painted all Allied nations as Jewish-controlled conspiracies bent on German extermination? The psychological impact was not uniform. For some, the broadcast provided immediate relief, permission to acknowledge doubts they had harbored but never voiced. For others, it created cognitive dissonance so severe that they retreated further into ideology, insisting that the broadcast was merely sophisticated propaganda, that British kindness was a trap, that true believers must remain vigilant. The camp's informal leadership, Those officers and NCOs who still wielded authority faced a delicate balance. Openly embracing the broadcast's message would be seen as collaboration. Rejecting it completely might spark dissent among prisoners who desperately wanted to believe that their former enemies were capable of mercy. British intelligence officers watched these reactions with clinical interest. They filed reports noting which prisoners seemed receptive to re-education and which remained hardened cases. But even the most cynical intelligence officer could not deny that something genuine had occurred. The broadcast had not been strategic manipulation alone. It had been an authentic expression of Christian charity, broadcast at a moment when such charity seemed almost impossible. And in that authenticity, it had achieved what calculated propaganda never could. It had planted genuine doubt in minds that had been closed for years. The BBC broadcast became a nightly ritual. Each evening at 1900 hours, the loudspeakers would crackle to life, and for 30 minutes the prisoners would hear readings from Scripture, prayers for peace, and occasionally, carefully curated news reports about reconstruction efforts beginning across Europe. The British authorities understood that they were engaged in an experiment, not just in prisoner management, but in something far more ambitious: the psychological rehabilitation of an entire generation. Behind the scenes, the infrastructure supporting this effort was substantial. The Political Warfare Executive, a branch of British intelligence responsible for psychological operations, worked closely with religious organizations to craft broadcasts that would resonate with German sensibilities without appearing propagandistic. They consulted with German Protestant and Catholic clergy who had fled the Reich, seeking advice on theological approaches that might penetrate Nazi indoctrination. They studied reports from other POW camps, noting which messages sparked resistance and which created openings for genuine change. But the broadcasts were only one element of a larger strategy. The British began organizing work details that took prisoners outside the camp to help repair bomb damage in nearby towns, to assist with the harvest on local farms, to clear rubble from London streets. These encounters with British civilians were carefully supervised, but genuine. German prisoners who had been told that British citizens would spit on them instead found themselves receiving cups of tea from elderly women who had lost sons in the war, working alongside British farmers who treated them with neither warmth nor cruelty, but simple human courtesy. Werner Schmidt, a former artillery officer, found himself assigned to a work detail helping rebuild a village church that had been damaged by a V-1 flying bomb, one of the weapons his own forces had launched. The irony was not lost on him. As he worked alongside a British vicar to repair the roof, the vicar spoke to him in halting German about his own son, killed in North Africa. "I pray for the German who killed him," the vicar said, his voice steady but not without pain. "I pray that God grants him peace because he too was someone's son." Werner had no response. He simply continued working, but something inside him, some carefully constructed wall, began to crumble. Not all the prisoners embraced the possibility of reconciliation. By late June, tensions within the camp had begun to surface. A group of hardcore National Socialists, led by a former SS officer named Otto Brenner, organized what they called resistance cells, small groups dedicated to maintaining ideological purity and punishing collaboration. They identified prisoners who seemed too eager to work with the British, who spoke too freely with guards, who expressed doubt about the righteousness of the German cause. At night, these collaborators sometimes found their rations stolen, their tents vandalized, threatening messages left on their bunks. The British authorities faced a dilemma. They could isolate the troublemakers, but that risked creating martyrs and reinforcing the narrative that the broadcasts were mere propaganda. They could ignore the tensions, but that endangered prisoners who were genuinely trying to change. In the end, they chose a middle path, identifying the ringleaders and transferring them to separate facilities designated for unreconstructed prisoners, while simultaneously expanding programs that rewarded cooperation and engagement. For the prisoners caught in the middle, the majority who were neither fanatic believers nor eager converts, these were agonizing days. Every choice carried weight. To attend the evening broadcasts openly risked being labeled a traitor by hardliners. To reject them completely meant closing the door on the only hope many had for making sense of their defeat. Paul Hoffman, a 35-year-old father of 3 who had left a comfortable life as a pharmacist to serve his country, found himself paralyzed by these contradictions. He wanted to believe that peace was possible, that he might one day return to Germany and rebuild a life for his family. But he also feared that accepting British mercy meant betraying the memory of fallen comrades, admitting that their deaths had been for nothing. One evening, after a particularly powerful broadcast about the parable of the prodigal son, Paul approached a British chaplain who had begun visiting the camp. "Tell me the truth," he said in broken English. "Do you truly forgive us? Or is this just politics?" The chaplain looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I don't speak for all British people," he said. "Some will never forgive, some have lost too much. But I believe that God commands forgiveness even when it seems impossible. And I believe that you, not Germany, not the Wehrmacht, but you, Paul, have the capacity to choose differently than you have been taught." By July, the camp at Kempton Park had become something unprecedented, a laboratory for moral rehabilitation on an industrial scale. The BBC broadcasts expanded beyond religious services to include educational programming. German prisoners heard lectures on political philosophy, discussions of democratic governance, even musical performances that showcased the cultural richness of the Allied nations. The British were careful not to bombard prisoners with anti-Nazi propaganda. Instead, they simply presented alternatives, allowing the prisoners themselves to draw comparisons. The results were mixed, but measurable. British authorities noted that approximately 40% of prisoners showed genuine engagement with the programming, attending optional discussion groups, and asking questions that indicated real intellectual struggle. Another 40% remained neutral, participating minimally but not resisting. The remaining 20% actively rejected the efforts, clinging to National Socialist ideology or simply withdrawing into sullen silence. Among those who engaged most deeply was a group of university-educated prisoners, former students, teachers, engineers, who had joined the Wehrmacht out of patriotic duty rather than ideological conviction. These men formed informal study groups, debating the broadcast late into the night, wrestling with questions they had been forbidden to ask during the Reich. What is the legitimate source of governmental authority? Can a nation commit crimes, or only individuals? What does it mean to love one's country while acknowledging its sins? One particular broadcast sparked intense discussion, a lecture on the concept of collective guilt versus individual responsibility. The speaker, a British philosopher, argued that while institutions could be criminal, punishing entire populations was both unjust and counterproductive. "The German people are not inherently evil," the voice from the radio declared. "They were led by evil men, propagandized by evil systems, and many committed evil acts. But evil is not a racial or national characteristic. It is a choice, renewed daily, that any human being in any nation might make when circumstances conspire to make evil seem reasonable." This distinction, between the German people and the Nazi regime, was revolutionary for men who had been taught that they were synonymous. It offered a path forward, the possibility of German identity without Nazi ideology, of patriotism without fascism, of national pride without supremacy. Not all prisoners accepted this framework, but for those who did, it was liberation of a kind even more profound than physical freedom. By August, as the war in the Pacific entered its final weeks, something remarkable was happening at Kempton Park. The boundary between captor and captive, while still strictly maintained, had developed nuances that would have been unthinkable months earlier. British guards knew prisoners by name. Prisoners occasionally helped guards with tasks. When news arrived of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, German prisoners and British guards stood together in horrified silence, contemplating the implications of weapons that could erase cities in an instant. The broadcasts evolved as well. The BBC began including German voices, not propaganda broadcasts by collaborators, but carefully selected recordings of German clergy, intellectuals, and resistance figures who had opposed Hitler. These Germans spoke directly to the prisoners, validating their suffering while challenging them to examine their complicity. One particularly powerful broadcast featured a recording of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor executed by the Nazis just weeks before the war's end, speaking about the duty to resist evil even at personal cost. The inclusion of German voices was strategic, but also genuine. It demonstrated that opposition to Nazism was not solely an Allied narrative, that there had been Germans, brave, thoughtful, faithful Germans, who had recognized the regime's evil and resisted. This countered the propaganda claim that all criticism of the Reich came from foreign enemies seeking Germany's destruction. The prisoners could not dismiss Bonhoeffer or other German resistors as traitors or propaganda tools. They had been Germans, They had been Christians. They had chosen differently. Hans Müller, the young soldier who had accepted a cigarette from Private Jenkins, found himself profoundly moved by these broadcasts. He began attending the camp's makeshift chapel services, where a combination of British and German clergy conducted worship. He started learning English from a sympathetic guard. Most significantly, he began writing letters home, letters that passed through censors but were not altered, letters in which he cautiously tried to share what he was learning. "Mother," he wrote, "I think perhaps we did not understand what we were fighting for. I think perhaps we were used by men who cared nothing for Germany, only for power. I am ashamed, but I am also grateful that I survived to learn this." As autumn approached and the enormity of Germany's defeat became undeniable, the Nuremberg trials beginning, the occupation zones established, the full horror of the concentration camps revealed to the world, the British authorities began preparing prisoners for repatriation. But they understood that sending these men back to a devastated, occupied Germany without psychological preparation would be disaster. The prisoners needed to understand what they would face: destroyed cities, shattered infrastructure, widespread hunger, and most difficult of all, the moral reckoning with the Holocaust. The broadcasts became more direct. Documentary footage from liberated concentration camps was shown to the prisoners, accompanied by narration that avoided hysteria but did not shy from truth. The screenings were mandatory, and the effect was devastating. Some prisoners insisted the footage was fabricated. Others vomited or fled the viewing areas. Many simply wept, overwhelmed by the realization of what had been done in their name, whether they had known of it or not. In the aftermath of these screenings, the camp chaplains worked overtime. Discussion groups formed spontaneously, men struggling to process what they had seen. The questions were agonizing. Did I contribute to this? Could I have known? What do I tell my children? The British did not offer easy answers. Instead, they emphasized individual responsibility, the importance of acknowledging truth, and the long road to redemption that Germany would have to walk. Klaus Richter, the former schoolteacher, found his vocation renewed in these weeks. He began teaching literacy classes to younger prisoners, but wove into his lessons careful discussions of ethics, morality, and civic responsibility. "When we return," he told his students, "Germany will need teachers who tell the truth, who teach children to think critically, who never again allow propaganda to masquerade as education." His classes grew in size, prisoners hungry for something to believe in beyond the ruins of the ideology that had failed them. The BBC broadcasts reflected this transitional moment. They began including practical information, what prisoners would find upon return, how the occupation zones functioned, what resources were available for rebuilding. But they also continued the moral education, emphasizing that Germany's future depended on Germans choosing a different path. "You will return to a defeated nation," one broadcast stated. "But defeat is not destiny. Germany has been defeated before and risen again. The question is, what kind of Germany will you rebuild? One based on domination and racial hatred, or one based on law, democracy, and human dignity?" In October, the British government announced a pilot program. Selected prisoners would be allowed to work in British communities for several months before repatriation, living with British families and learning trades that would help them rebuild Germany. The program was controversial. British citizens who had lost loved ones protested the idea of coddling Nazis. But proponents argued that creating a generation of Germans who understood democracy and had personal relationships with former enemies was essential for lasting peace. Hans Müller was among those selected. He was placed with a family in Surrey, the Johnsons, who had lost their eldest son at Dunkirk. The first dinner was excruciatingly awkward. Hans sat at the table, acutely aware that he might have fought against the man whose portrait hung on the wall. Mrs. Johnson served him soup with hands that trembled slightly. Mr. Johnson asked stiff questions about Hans's family in broken German. But gradually, over weeks, something shifted. Hans helped repair the Johnsons' barn. He played with their youngest daughter. He shared stories about his own family, his hopes to study engineering, his shame at what he had learned about the camps. One evening, as they listened to a BBC broadcast together, something Hans did voluntarily now, Mrs. Johnson turned to him. "I hated you at first," she said simply. "Not you specifically, but what you represented. But watching you these weeks, I've realized that my son and you are not so different. You were both boys who believed what your countries told you, who fought because that's what young men are expected to do. The men who started this war, they're the ones I hate, not you." Hans wept then as he had not wept since the war ended, because in her forgiveness, not easy, not complete but genuine, he glimpsed what the BBC broadcasts had been trying to teach all along, that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the choice to see humanity in those who had been enemies. That reconciliation was not forgetting, but refusing to let past hatreds determine future relationships. That redemption was possible, though never guaranteed and certainly never easy. December 1945. The camp at Kempton Park was nearly empty now, most prisoners having been repatriated or transferred to work programs. Those who remained were the hardest cases, men who had nowhere to return to, whose families had been killed or displaced, or who were under investigation for war crimes. Even here, among those with the least hope, the broadcasts continued. On Christmas Eve, the BBC aired a special program. German and British choirs sang together. Silent Night in both languages, the melody weaving between English and German like a bridge across an abyss. The broadcast included messages from both British and German clergy, from politicians and ordinary citizens, all speaking about the possibility of peace. Winston Churchill himself made a brief appearance, his famous voice gravelly but earnest. "Let those who fought against us know that Britain seeks not revenge, but justice, not the subjugation of the German people, but their restoration to the community of civilized nations. The path will be long and difficult. Trust has been shattered, but we must begin somewhere, and we begin with the recognition that even in our darkest hours, we remain fellow inhabitants of this small planet, all children of the same God." Werner Schmidt, the artillery officer who had repaired the church he had helped destroy, sat listening to this broadcast in the empty camp. He was among the last to be repatriated, scheduled to leave in January. As he listened to the choirs, he thought about the British vicar who had told him about praying for his son's killer. He thought about the months of broadcasts, the gradual erosion of certainties he had once held with absolute conviction. He thought about Germany, the Germany that awaited him, broken, occupied, morally bankrupt. And he made a decision. He would return. He would help rebuild. But more than buildings, he would work to rebuild something more essential. A Germany that could acknowledge its sins without losing its soul. A Germany that could be proud of its culture and achievements without need to dominate others. A Germany that had learned through the most terrible means imaginable that nationalism unchecked by morality leads only to destruction. It was an impossible task. But then, everything about the last year had seemed impossible. The broadcasts had been impossible. Who could imagine a victorious nation offering spiritual sustenance to defeated enemies? The forgiveness he had witnessed had been impossible. The transformation he felt within himself had been impossible. And yet, all of it had happened. On New Year's Eve, 1945, the final broadcast from Kempton Park aired. The camp was nearly deserted, just a handful of prisoners remaining. But the BBC transmitted the program nationwide, knowing that former POWs would be listening across Britain, working in factories and fields, living with British families, preparing to return home. The broadcast was simple, a conversation between a British veteran who had fought in North Africa and a German veteran who had been at El Alamein, on opposite sides of that brutal desert campaign. They did not discuss tactics or strategy. They talked about fear, about missing home, about the absurdity of trying to kill strangers you had no personal quarrel with, about the letters from family that sustained them, about the moment of capture, the terror and relief mixed together, about discovering that the enemy was not the monster propaganda had depicted, but simply another human being caught in history's machinery. "I killed men like you," the British veteran said. "I don't know how many. I was following orders, doing my duty, but I killed them. And for years I could only think of them as the enemy, faceless, threatening, less than human. Because if I thought of them as men with families and hopes and fears, I couldn't bear what I had done. But now listening to you, I realize that denying their humanity was itself a kind of continuing violence. They were men. I killed men. And I must live with that. We all must live with what we've done." The German veteran responded quietly. "In my country now we are learning what was done in our name. The camps, the murders, things I did not do myself, things I did not know about in their full horror, but things that were done by my countrymen in service of the ideology I fought for. I cannot claim innocence. Even if I pulled no trigger in a camp, I wore the uniform. I fought the war that made the camps possible, and I must live with that. We all must." The broadcast ended with both men acknowledging an uncomfortable truth, that peace required not the erasure of guilt, but its acknowledgement, that moving forward meant carrying the weight of the past, not discarding it, that reconciliation was not a moment but a practice, renewed daily through the choice to see former enemies as fellow human beings. For those listening, in the camp, in British homes, in German POW facilities across the occupation zones, the message was clear. The war had ended in military defeat. But the deeper war, the war for human souls, for the possibility of a different future, that war was just beginning. And unlike the military conflict, this war could not be won through force or conquest. It could only be won through the slow, difficult daily choice to forgive when forgiveness seemed impossible, to build when destruction seemed easier, to hope when despair seemed rational. January 15, 1946. Victoria Station, London. Werner Schmidt stood on the platform with 40 other German prisoners, waiting for the train that would take them to Dover, then to a ship, then home. They wore British-issued civilian clothes, carried small satchels with their few possessions, and held documents certifying their clearance for repatriation. Around them, Londoners hurried about their business, barely glancing at the group of former enemies preparing to leave their shores. Werner thought about the last 7 months, the journey from soldier to prisoner to something else entirely. Not friend exactly, but no longer enemy. He thought about the broadcasts, those nightly transmissions that had seemed so bizarre at first, so impossibly idealistic. He thought about the British vicar's son, killed in a war neither young man had started. He thought about Mrs. Johnson, serving soup with trembling hands to the man who might have killed her son. He thought about the thousands of small acts of mercy, grudging or gracious, that had brought him to this moment. The train arrived. As the prisoners boarded, a small group of British veterans stood on the platform, watching, not cheering, not jeering, simply bearing witness. One stepped forward, an older man with medals from the Great War pinned to his coat. He approached Werner, extended his hand. "Rebuild well," he said in careful German. "We'll be watching, hoping you succeed." Werner took the hand, shook it firmly, nodded. No words seemed adequate. He boarded the train, found a seat by the window, watched London slide past as they pulled away from the station. The city bore scars of war, bombed buildings, empty spaces where neighborhoods had stood, memorials to the dead rising like accusations, but also rebuilding, cranes and scaffolds, workers and engineers, life persisting, insisting, refusing to be extinguished. Across Germany in hundreds of towns and cities, former prisoners were returning, carrying with them the seeds of change planted in British POW camps. They would face suspicion from those who had never left, accusations of collaboration, the immense difficulty of building democracy in a nation that had known only authoritarianism. Many would fail, some would retreat into silence or bitterness, but others would persist, would become teachers and politicians and businessmen who remembered the BBC broadcasts, who remembered that their former enemies had chosen mercy over revenge, who understood that Germany's future depended on rejecting the ideology that had led them to ruin. The broadcasts had not converted every listener. No single program, no matter how well crafted, could undo years of propaganda and ideology. But they had created fissures in certainty, open spaces where doubt could breathe, demonstrated that alternatives to hatred were possible. In a nation that would be divided for 40 years, that would struggle for generations with its past, these small seeds of reconciliation would prove essential. They would not flower immediately. Change never does. But they would persist, roots deepening silently, waiting for the right season to bloom. History remembers the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, the grand geopolitical gestures that rebuilt Western Europe. But history often forgets the smaller victories, the daily choice to treat enemies as human beings, the broadcasts that spoke of forgiveness when vengeance seemed justified, the cups of tea shared across chasms of loss and guilt. These acts did not make headlines, they awarded no medals, but they made possible everything that followed: the German economic miracle, the European Union, the unimaginable reality of French and German soldiers serving side by side in NATO. The men who heard those BBC broadcasts in the summer of 1945 are mostly gone now, their memories fading into history. But the lesson remains, urgent as ever in a world still riven by conflicts that seem intractable, hatreds that seem permanent. Peace is not inevitable. Reconciliation is not natural. Both require the daily practice of seeing humanity in those we have been taught to hate, extending mercy when vengeance seems righteous, choosing to rebuild rather than destroy. The British could have brutalized their prisoners. International law gave them latitude to exact revenge, but they chose differently. Not from weakness, but from a profound understanding that lasting peace required more than military victory. It required the transformation of hearts and minds, the slow rebuilding of human connections, severed by war. That choice, replicated in thousands of daily interactions between former enemies, changed history.